My motive for doing what I am going to do is simply personal revenge. I do not expect to accomplish anything by it." Those were the words written in a cold, cramped hand inside a 10 by 12-foot plywood cabin in the frozen wilderness of Lincoln, Montana. The year was 1996, and the man inside was Theodore J. Kaczynski. To his neighbors, he was the ragged hermit who lived on rabbit meat and rode a rusty bike. To the rest of the world, he was the Unabomber, a phantom who had spent 17 years systematically dismantling the American sense of security. He was the most expensive ghost in the history of the FBI, a genius with a 168 IQ who turned the simple act of opening a package into a game of Russian roulette. People think the Unabomber was just a madman in the woods, but the truth is much more terrifying. He wasn't just a killer. He was a prophet of doom who used high-level mathematics to calculate the exact moment society would break. For nearly 2 decades, the FBI threw everything they had at him. They spent over $50 million, assigned 500 agents to the task, and followed thousands of leads into dead ends. It was the largest manhunt in the Bureau's history, and they were losing. They were looking for a group of radical terrorists, maybe a cell of anti-government militants. They never expected it was just one man sitting in a shack with no electricity, no running water, and a wood stove, building the most sophisticated pipe bombs the world had ever seen. He was a math prodigy who had vanished from a prestigious career at UC Berkeley to wage a one-man war against the future. And for 17 years, he was winning. Ted Kaczynski didn't start as a monster. He started as a miracle. Born in 1942 to a working-class Polish family in Chicago, he was the kind of kid parents dream of. He skipped 2 grades, aced every exam without trying, and was playing complex musical scores while other kids were learning to tie their shoes. But there was a shadow behind the brilliance. Ted was quiet, socially awkward, and intensely sensitive. His parents pushed him hard, fueling his intellect, but perhaps starving his soul. By the time he hit 16, he wasn't just smart, he was an outsider. He was accepted into Harvard University at an age when most kids are just getting their driver's licenses. Imagine being a 16-year-old kid from a blue-collar background thrown into the Shark Tank of America's elite. Harvard in the late 50s wasn't just a school, it was a finishing school for the people who would run the world. Ted was the youngest, the poorest, and the most socially isolated person on campus. He lived in a dorm room that reportedly smelled like rotting food because he refused to leave it for anything other than class. He was a fish out of water who had been tossed into a desert. He wrote letters to his mother that were dripping with venom, blaming her for pushing him out into a world he wasn't ready for. He felt the snobbery of the professors and the arrogance of his peers like a physical weight. It was here, in the hollowed halls of Cambridge, that the first cracks in his psyche began to widen.
But the true breaking point wasn't just loneliness. It was a man named Dr. Henry Murray. Murray was a titan in the world of psychology, a man with deep ties to the military-industrial complex. He was looking for subjects for a very specific kind of experiment, one funded by the CIA under a project that would later become infamous, MK Ultra. The goal was simple but brutal: find out what it takes to break a human being's sense of self. Murray recruited 22 gifted students, including Ted. They were told they'd be debating their most cherished beliefs with a peer. Instead, they were strapped into chairs, covered in electrodes, and subjected to hours of intense, personalized verbal abuse by a trained interrogator. They were mocked, humiliated, and stripped of their dignity while cameras rolled. Ted, the youngest and most vulnerable, was subjected to this for 3 years. The CIA wanted to see if they could engineer a truth drug of words. What they actually engineered was a ticking time bomb. By the 1970s, the world was on fire. San Francisco was the Belfast of North America, with radical groups like the Weather Underground blowing up government buildings every other week. Amidst this chaos, a new pattern emerged. 12 bombs, all linked by a single mysterious signature. They weren't like the crude devices of the student radicals. These were masterpieces of destruction. They were encased in handcrafted wooden boxes, polished to a mirror finish. There was no DNA, no hair, no fingerprints. The builder even used 19-cent stamps from years prior to avoid being traced by post office records. He was a ghost who left only beautiful, deadly wood. The targets seemed random: a computer store owner in Sacramento, a professor at Northwestern, a flight from Chicago to DC. The FBI dubbed him Unabomber because he seemed to target universities and airlines.
Back in his Montana cabin, Ted was living a double life. He was a master of the open loop. Every time the FBI thought they had a profile, he'd change his tactics. He didn't use a phone. He didn't have a car. He wrote everything in a code so complex it would make a KGB officer sweat. He had shoes with soles that were smaller than his actual feet to throw off trackers. He had a collection of wigs and fake mustaches. He was a technician of the highest order. He'd spend weeks rasping down aluminum blocks into fine powder to create the perfect explosive mix. He wasn't just building bombs, he was perfecting a craft. In 1985, he claimed his first victim, Hugh Scruton, a computer store owner. When Ted read about the death in the newspaper, he didn't feel guilt. He felt a sense of professional pride. He even laughed when he saw the FBI was offering a $25,000 reward. To Ted, that was just a rating of his performance. But even a genius makes mistakes. In 1987, a woman in Salt Lake City saw a man in a gray hoodie and aviator sunglasses placing a package. She described him to the police, and the iconic sketch was born. For the next 6 years, the Unabomber went silent. The case went cold. The FBI thought he might have died or moved on, but Ted wasn't gone. He was evolving. He realized that killing people wasn't enough. He needed them to understand. He began writing, not just journals, but a manifesto, 35,000 words titled Industrial Society and Its Future. He argued that the Industrial Revolution was the greatest disaster to ever befall the human race. He claimed that technology was a trap that would eventually strip every human of their autonomy and turn us into cogs in a machine. He wasn't just an angry man anymore. He was a revolutionary with a philosophy.
In 1993, the bombs started again. They were more powerful, more lethal, and more precise. A computer scientist and a geneticist were nearly killed. Then came the ultimate gamble. Ted sent a letter to the New York Times. He promised to stop the bombings permanently if they published his manifesto in full. It was a hostage situation involving the entire American public. The FBI was stuck in a nightmare. If they didn't publish, more people would die. If they did publish, they were giving a terrorist a megaphone. They chose to publish, hoping that someone, somewhere, would recognize the writing style. Enter David Kaczynski. David was Ted's younger brother, and for years he had lived in the shadow of Ted's brilliance. David was a kind, empathetic man who also shared some of Ted's anti-technology views. He had even lived in a cabin for a while, but David wasn't a killer. When the manifesto was published in the Washington Post, David didn't want to read it. It was his wife, Linda, who pushed him. She had a funny feeling about Ted, even though she'd never met him. She'd heard the stories of Ted's descent into isolation and his growing rage. When David finally sat down with the paper, his heart sank. The phrases were too familiar. The logic was too specific. The obsession with the technician class was something he'd heard in Ted's letters for decades. He realized that the man he loved, the brother he had built a cabin with, was the most wanted man in America.
The decision David faced was an impossible one. Protect your blood or protect the world. After months of soul-searching, he contacted the FBI. But even with a tip, the FBI was terrified. They didn't have enough for an arrest, only enough for a search warrant. They set up a perimeter around the cabin in Lincoln, Montana. They were convinced the place was booby-trapped. They expected a shootout, a grand finale for a man who had eluded them for 17 years. But when they finally knocked on the door, they didn't find a supervillain. They found a man who looked like he'd crawled out of the earth. Ted was rail-thin, smelling of wood smoke and unwashed skin. His hair was a matted mess, and his clothes were literally rotting off his frame. He had been in the middle of preparing a new bomb, his hands covered in aluminum dust. The genius of the wilderness was caught because he didn't expect a surveyor to knock on his door. When the feds stormed the shack, they hit the motherlode. 40,000 pages of journals, handwritten in a code that even the FBI's top cryptographers couldn't crack at first. They found the key to the code buried in the cabin. It revealed a man who wasn't just a philosopher, but a cold-blooded observer of his own atrocities. He wrote about the satisfaction of seeing his bombs work. He wrote about his hatred for leftists, for doctors, for women who rejected him, and even for a neighbor's toddler whose crying annoyed him. The trial was a circus. Ted's defense team tried to save him from the death penalty by arguing he was a paranoid schizophrenic. This was the ultimate insult to Ted. He didn't want to be saved by a diagnosis, he wanted his ideas to be taken seriously. He tried to fire his lawyers and even tried to hang himself in his cell to avoid being labeled insane. Eventually, he took a plea deal, life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent to 80X Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, where he would spend the next quarter century in a concrete box.
But even behind bars, the loop stayed open. Ted Kaczynski became a cult figure. He struck up a strange, dark friendship with Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. He received thousands of letters from admirers. Some were young environmentalists who saw him as a radical hero. Others were women who fell in love with the intellectual killer. He even had a lady love, a school teacher with whom he shared a deep romantic correspondence for years. He wrote classical music for her. He became a philosopher king of the prison system, publishing books and influencing a new generation of anti-civ thinkers. The paradox of Ted Kaczynski is that he was right about the problems, but horrifically wrong about the solutions. He saw the rise of surveillance, the mental health crisis caused by social media, and the environmental collapse decades before the rest of us. But his revenge didn't stop the machine. It just added more blood to its gears. In June 2023, at the age of 81, Ted Kaczynski ended his own life in a prison medical center. He left behind a legacy that is as disturbing as it is fascinating. People still debate his sanity, but perhaps the most chilling part of his story isn't that he was crazy. It's that he was perfectly sane, and he decided that the only way to save humanity was to start killing it. He thought he was the architect of a new world, but in the end, he was just a man in a box, surrounded by the very technology he hated, waiting for the clock to run out. You can arrest a man, you can bury a body, but as Ted himself believed, you can't arrest an idea. The question is, as we move deeper into the digital age he feared, are we heading exactly where he said we would? If you think Ted was the only one with these thoughts, you haven't seen the dark corners of the internet lately. But that's a story for the next video, the one about the people who decided that Ted didn't go far enough.